take a look at the handout. Before we take a look at the handout, so it's Parshas Vayeishev, say over a medrash that I say almost every year. Things I say over every year. The first Rashi in Chumash, right? Why did Hashem start with Bereshis to teach us Eretz Yisrael is ours? And we learn that Rashi 3 times a year: Parshas Bereshis, Parshas Bo, Parshas HaChodesh. Good Rashi to keep on learning over. Parshas Vayeishev, after the Shvatim sold Yosef, and the Shvatim come back with a bloody robe, and they show it to Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu assumes at that moment that Yosef has been killed. Yaakov rips his garments, he puts on sackcloth, he mourns, he mourns for many days for Yosef. He refused to be comforted, and so he was in a state of availus for 22 years. Yosef was sold when he was 17. Yaakov met Yosef again in Mitzrayim when Yosef was 39. They were away from each other for 22 years. Yosef got sold several times, Rashi says. Excuse me. He ends up in Mitzrayim. The pasuk says in Perek Lamed Ches pasuk Aleph, it was at that time. Vayevid Yehuda meis echa vayet adish adulam yishmo chira. Vayasham Yehuda bas ish Kenan yishmo shua vaykachev vayavay eleh. At that time, Yehuda vayevid Yehuda meis echa. Yehuda left his family, and he went to Ish Adulami ushmochi. And he finds a wife. And then the story goes on with the heir, Onan, and then Peretz and Zerach through Tamar. So the end of this story, quote unquote, I hate to use the word story, we're not supposed to use story when we're talking about Chumash, but the end of this episode, we have Yehuda started, he left his family behind, and he went to Ish Adulami, and he gets married. And at the end of the Aliyah, Pasuk Chavtes, Tamar gives birth, Pasuk Chavtes, Tamar gives birth to twins from Yehuda, Peretz and Zerach, and David HaMelech, Mashiach ben David, comes from Peretz. So, from bookend to bookend, Yosef's been sold, a family tragedy. Yaakov is in mourning, he can't even be comforted. Yehuda leaves the family, he gets married. At the end, the other bookend is Peretz and Zerach are born, and Peretz becomes the progenitor of David HaMelech, Mashiach ben David. So that's how the story begins and ends. Yaakov is mourning, Yehuda goes to find a wife, and at the end of the episode, we have the progenitor of Melech HaMashiach. The Medrash Rabbah in this week's Parsha, it says as follows. Parsha, it's called Parsha Pei Hey, Parsha 85 in the Medrash Rabbah in Bereshis, and it's paragraph 2. Reb Shmuel bar Nachman. Reb Shmuel bar Nachman Posak. Reb Shmuel bar Nachman opened up when Reb Shmuel bar Nachman would give a drasha on this parsha about Yehuda leaving his family. He would open the drasha with a pasuk. This is a common thing you find in Medrash, you find in the Gemara, that Tanoim or Amoraim had a specific pasuk they would use to open up a drasha and open up a whole idea. So when Rab Shmuel Bar Nachman wanted to discuss these psukim, where Yehuda leaves his family, finds a wife, and then from Yehuda finds a wife, and at the end of the process, his wife dies, and Aaron Onan died. At the end of the process, from Tamar comes Peretz and Zerah, the progenitor Peretz of Mashiach. So how did Reb Shmuel Bar Nachman open up the discussion, his drasha about this parsha? He quoted a pasuk in Yirmiyah, Perek Chavtes, chapter 29 in Yirmiyah. It says there, Ki anochi yodati es hamachshavos. God says, only I know man's thoughts. No one else knows what man is thinking. Shvatim hayu asukim. The Medrash now describes for us. The Medrash now describes for us what the Jewish world looked like. Remember, the Jewish world is a compact world. You have Yaakov, right? Rachel's already died. We're not sure exactly when Leah died, but Rachel's already died. And we have 12 Shvatim. We have Dinah. And some of the Shvatim may be married, maybe all of them are married, whatever the picture is. By the time they go down to Mitzrayim, they're going to be 70 of them. 70 men, Shiloh, where the women are, where the wives are. Okay, we're talking about 70 Jews when they end up going to Mitzrayim, quote unquote, world Jewry was 70 people. And when will they be 70 people? There'll be 70 people about 22 years from now. Yosef's just been sold, Yosef 17. They get to Mitzrayim. When Yaakov gets to Mitzrayim, he's 39, Yosef is 39. So between the sale of Yosef and Yaakov going down to Mitzrayim is 22 years. And at the end of that 22 years, there are 70 ashot, 70 nefesh, actually, 70 Jewish souls going down to Mitzrayim. So 22 years earlier, we don't know what world Jewry looked like, but it's Yaakov. There's no Rachel. Maybe there is Leah, we're not sure. And there's 12 Shvatim, Dinah. Maybe the 12 Shvatim are married. Some of them, all of them, maybe some of them even have children, but it's not 70. That's what world Jewry looks like at this moment. So now the Medrash Rabbah wants to tell us, what does world Jewry look like right after Yosef was sold, and at the time that Yehuda leaves the family behind. Now Yehuda is he's going to be king. He's the respected young man in the family. This is Yehuda, and before they sold Yosef, all the Shvatim, Binyamin wasn't there, but the Shvatim were discussing with Yehuda what to do. Yehuda is a very respected person in the family. So this respected person in the family, Yehuda, he leaves his family that's in mourning behind, and he goes off and he gets married. So the Nala Medrash says, Shvatim hoyu asukim b'mechirase shel Yosef. The Shvatim, the brothers, were still dealing with the fact that they sold Yosef. They realized that they had caused their father a tremendous amount of pain, and they're still dealing with what exactly did we do here. Yosef Yosef is a slave. He's been sold to Mitzrayim. So he's not in good condition. The Medrash says he's fasting and he's wearing sackcloth like a slave. Reuven in particular, he is fasting and he's wearing sackcloth. Why? Because remember, Reuven put Yosef in the bar, in the pit, for the purpose of saving him. He had to go back to Yaakov, Rashi explains, for whatever reason Rashi explains. And then by the time Reuven came back to the bar, Yosef wasn't in the bar anymore. He was sold. So Reuven held himself responsible for Yosef's sale. So he's fasting and in sackcloth. Yaakov is fasting and in sackcloth and fasting. So what does the world Jewry look like? This is disaster. Yosef is a slave, fasting sackcloth. Yaakov lost a son. That's his assumption at this point. He's lost his son. He's the fasting and sackcloth. Reuven, who took personal responsibility for this, is in fasting and sackcloth. The other Shvatim are trying to figure out what in the world they did here to cause everyone so much pain. This is not a good situation. It's a disaster. Yehuda leaves the family in the middle of all this morning. Instead of trying to help the family, he is Yehuda, the looked up to brother. Instead of trying to help out the situation, he leaves and he goes to find a wife. So what would you say when you hear this story? You're telling your friends a story. I want to tell you a story. There was a terrible situation in family X. Terrible situation. Family X, Nebuch, there was a tremendous fight in the family, and Shmuel, the son, ran away. Nobody knows where he is. And the whole family is literally in mourning. They're ripping themselves apart. They're trying to figure out what happened here. Why did Shmuel run away? Is he safe? Is he okay? How did they find him? File a police report. The police can't find. What do we do here? And one of the brothers of Shmuel, Reuven, we'll call him Yehuda. Yehuda says, you know what? I had enough of all this mourning stuff. I'm going to find a shidduch. And you hear this story, you say, what? The whole family is in mourning, and the most respected brother in the family goes off to find a shidduch? What kind of boy is this? And that would be our impression from this parsha. The whole Jewish world is in mourning, and Yaakov is in terrible mourning, and Yehuda, his son, decides, I've had enough of this, I'm going to get married. We'd look down at Yehuda and say, this is definitely not a Jewish king. It seems like he's a selfie kind of person. He's not concerned for other people. He's not concerned for his family. This is a person who is absolutely not concerned about anyone except himself. Scratch him off the list of potential kings. After all, our kings, who are our kings? Who are our leaders? Moshe was a shepherd of sheep. David was a shepherd of sheep. Why was this a characteristic trait of our great leaders? Because when a person's a shepherd of sheep, he counts every single sheep. There's no such thing as you take the 100 sheep out of the corral, and you come back to the corral with 98, and you say, it's Beseda. I have 98 out of 100. Maybe some fox or wolf got a hold of 2 of them. Okay, Beseda, 98 out of 100 is good. A Roy Yetzayin is concerned for every single one of his sheep. He watches them carefully, and he makes sure they're safe and secure, every single one. This is why our great leaders started as shepherds of sheep. And here we have a man, Yehuda, who's going to be the progenitor of the Jewish kingship, the progenitor of David, HaMelech, the progenitor of Melech Mashiach. And we would scratch him off the list. I don't want Yehuda to be my king. It looks like he's a selfie. He's wrapped up in himself. Everyone here is mourning, and he says, I've had enough of this. I'm going to find my wife. So how did Reb Shmuel Bar Nachman start this drasha? Reb Shmuel Bar Nachman started this drasha, as we said, with a pasuk in Yirmiyah Chavtes. Anoch Yanoch Yodatz Machshavos. Only God knows what a human being is thinking. When we read this story, we see a selfie in it. We see a selfish Yehuda in it. But God knows what's going on inside Yehuda's mind. What happened at this moment when Yehuda decided, I'm going to get a wife? What was God doing? We know what Yehuda did, went to find a wife. We know the rest of the Jewish world is in mourning, they're fasting, they're in sackcloth. What's God doing at this moment? The whole Jewish world's in sackcloth. Yehuda went to get a wife. What's God doing now? HaKadosh Baruch Hu haya oiseg boiroi oiroi shel melech HaMashiach. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is involved, so to speak. He's creating the light for Mashiach. Where's that light of Mashiach going to come from? Yehuda. We've mentioned earlier that that's the bookends of the story. The bookends begin, Yehuda says, I have enough of this morning, I'm going to find a wife. By the time the story ends, Tamar, his daughter-in-law, former daughter-in-law. Daughter-in-law gives birth from him to Peretz and Zerach, and Peretz is the progenitor of David and Mashiach, David HaMelech and Mashiach ben David. So what was the Rebbeinu Shalom doing when the whole world is mourning, the Jewish world is mourning, and Yehuda decides, I'm going to get a wife? What's the Rebbeinu Shalom doing? Rebbeinu Shalom is saying, this guy is unbelievable. This young man, Yehuda, is unbelievable. I am now creating the light of Mashiach to come from this young man. And Mashiach is going to come from this young man, because at the end of this episode, Peretz will be born. And we'll have David HaMelech and Melech HaMashiach. That's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing. Vayhi ba'esahi vayered Yehuda. B'terem tochli yolada kodim shaloi noilad v'shabbat avishin noilad goyla achman. The Rebbeinu Shalom created Mashiach. So if you want to know where, what pasuk, what word in the Sefer Torah is a signal that God is bringing the light of Mashiach into the world, it's in this week's Parsha, where it says Vayehi ba'esahi. We'll give you the exact sign for Vayehi ba'esahi, so you can listen to the Bal Koreh and think about Melech HaMashiach as he says the words. Perek Lamed Ches, Pasuk Aleph, it's the Aliyah of Revi'i. Vayehi ba'esahi. So when we read the Pasuk, it says, and it was at that time Yehuda went and left his family. Reb Shmuel Bar Nachman's teaching us, Vayhi ba'esahi, and it was at that time. This is a very special time. This is a very special moment in history. The light of Mashiach is being created. That's our pasuk in this week's parsha, Revi. Vayhi ba'esahi, it was at that time when you think that Yehuda is selfish and looking for a wife and leaving his family behind. Only God knows what's in man's heart. Vayehi ba'esahi, it was at that time. What time? That special time when God created the light of Mashiach to come out of Yehuda. What exactly was Yehuda doing at this moment? God says, I know the thoughts in his heart. You think he's acting selfishly. I know what's really going on in his heart. What was really going on in his heart? That God said, this is the king. He is going to bring Peretz, David HaMelech, and Mashiach ben David into this world. This is the moment when he leaves the family and seeks a wife. This is a king. Take a look at the page base of the WhatsApp. I believe it was sent out by WhatsApp. Page Bays has a Gemara in Gittin at the bottom. It's Daf Samach Hamid Bays in Gittin. The Gemara has an interesting machlokas, the one that we would be able to answer immediately, but that's because we don't know as much as the Gemara, so it would be a superficial answer. The Gemara has discussion whether most of the Torah is written down as it was given to Moshe, and just a little of the Torah is Torah Shebal Peh, the oral law. Or was a little written down and most of it is oral law? Is most of it written down with some oral law to explain it? Or is some written down with most of it given through the oral law? Machlokes, the Gemara has two different sheets. So Gemara says on the second line, Amar Belaza, Torah rov b'ksav umiyat al peh. Torah, the majority of Torah has been written down, and a little of it was given orally to Moshe. Shenemar, the pasuk says in Hosea, Echtov lo rube tarasi k'mozor nechshav. We'll come back to this pasuk. Rabbi Yochanan says, what we would conclude, we know that there's Chamisha Chumshei Torah, and we know that's pretty limited, but we know that Torah Shebal Peh, the oral law, is massive. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Roiv al Peh, the vast majority of the Torah was transmitted orally from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe, and Moshe down the generations, and only a small portion of the Torah was written down. Shenema, Rabbi Yochanan says, it says in the pasuk in Shemois, in Parshas Ki Sisa, Ki Alpi Hadvorim Ha'ele, the Pasuk says, Ki Alpi Hadvorim Ha'ele, Karati Itcha Bris Ves Yisrael. Ki Alpi. Now, literally the word Alpi means, because of this, I made a covenant with the Jewish people. Rabbi Yochanan has a drasha. P means mouth. Ki alpi hadvar ha'ela, based upon the word of mouth, the transmission of Torah sheba'al peh, I made a covenant with the Jewish people. So Rabbi Yochanan learns from here that the covenant that the Jewish people have with the Ribono Shel Olam is based on Torah sheba'al peh, the transmission of the oral law. So Gemara says, "V'ida nami haksiv echtav le'rube taybasi hahu atmue kametama echtav le'rube taybasi halei k'mayzar nechshavu." So the Gemara asks on Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says the majority part of the Torah is an oral transmission, and only a small part was written down. So the Gemara asks, what do we do with that first pasuk we quoted in Hosea, where the pasuk says, "Echtav le'rubi tayrasi," I wrote down most of my Torah. It's a pasuk in Hosea. K'mozar nechshavu. If you read that with a period at the end, Echtav lo rube torasi, I wrote down the majority, God speaking through Hosea. Echtav lo rube torasi, I wrote down the majority of my Torah. K'mozar nechshavu. And the Jewish people became strangers to that Torah. Period. What does that pasuk say? The majority of the Torah is written down. And Rabbi Yochanan says the majority of the Torah is Baal Peh. It's an oral transmission. How does Rabbi Yochanan learn the pasuk? So the Gemara answers, Atmui kametama. It's not a period. It's like an exclamation point. The way you read the pasuk is Echtav le'rube tayrasi k'mayzar nechshavu. God said through Hosea, if I would have written down most of the Torah, the Jews would be strangers to the Torah. It's not a period. I did write down most of the Torah, and the Jews became strangers to it. Rabbi Yochanan says that's not how you read the pasuk. Pasuk is a tamir, an exclamation. Echtav le'rube tayrasi. If I would have written down most of the Torah, the Jewish people would be strangers. We'll soon see what that means. We'll see right now what it means. Let's take a look at the Tosfos. Atmui kametama. B'medrash amrinan k'mozor nechshavu she'ovdei kachovim kosvu es haTorah v'im hoya nichtav hakol Yisrael hoya ovdei kachovim hakol kaisvim. We know that the Goyim wrote down the Old Testament. How did they know what to write down? Because Chamisha Chumshei Torah was written down and it became public. And they took it and translated it into Greek. Mashiach's to come, B'tzayin Hashem today, we shouldn't have to fast on Asar B'Tevis. Hashem Mashiach doesn't come, we're going to fast Asar B'Tevis. In the Slichas of Asar B'Tevis, we say that there are 3 days of darkness, 3 days that a person can fast in Tevis. The 8th day of Tevis, the 9th day of Tevis, and the 10th day of Tevis. We know about the 10th day of Tevis, we do fast. That has to do with Nebuchadnezzar setting up a siege around the city of Yerushalayim. On the 9th day of Tevis, Ezra HaSofer died. On the 8th day of Tevis, the Greeks took the Torah and translated it into Greek, or I guess you would say maybe Latin, whatever you want to call it. They translated the Torah into Yavannit. The result of that was the 5 books of Moshe became worldwide known, and everybody has their own 2 cents about what it means. So when the Torah was translated into Greek, the Medrash says, 3 days of darkness came to the world. And we say this in Slichas on Asar B'Teves. On the 8th day, the Greeks translated the Torah into Greek, Yavanis. And on the 9th day, Ezra HaSopher died. And on the 10th day, Melech Bavel besieged Jerusalem, besieged the old city. On the 8th day, when the Torah was translated into Greek, 3 days of darkness came to the world. Chashecha. So Tosas brings down this medrash explaining Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that most of the Torah is oral transmission. A small part of the Torah was written down, but the oral transmission makes up the majority of Torah. Why? Because Echtav lo rube Torasi exclamation point. If I had written down most of the Torah, Jews would be strangers to the Torah. Meaning, right now, the 5 books of Moshe, the Pentateuch, whatever they call it, Pentateuch, whatever they call it, everybody's got the Old Testament. And everybody sticks their nose into what it means and what it doesn't mean. I'll give you an example in a second. But Baruch Hashem, Rabbi Yochanan says, that's all that God wrote down. Just a summary, a little part of the Torah. So when the Goyim, which God knew was going to happen, the Goyim are going to translate the Torah, they don't know what's going on. So when they read, tie it as a sign on your hand, and put a totofis, or they translate phylacteries, put a phylactery on your head, nobody knows what's going on. They can translate to whatever they want. They don't know what it is. Is it a box? Is it black? Is it green? What goes in the box? What color are the straps? How do you knot the straps? They don't have a clue. And write it on the doorpost. What should you write on the doorpost? They don't have a clue. And even if they knew what to write on the doorpost, they take a pen and write it on the doorpost. They don't know about cloth and ink and how to make it and how to roll it and what side of the door to put it on, the right side, the left. They're clueless. So Rabbi Yochanan says that the situation was God knew that they're going to translate the Torah into all their languages. And that's all they can do is translate the written Torah. And it doesn't mean anything to them. They don't know what's going on. But Rabbi Yochanan says, had God written everything down and given it that way to Moshe, he would have written a Torah that says, write it on the doors of your home, and this is what you should write. You write the following Parshas, and you put it on the right side. And this is how you make the ink. And this is the kind of cloth you use. And this is what you do. And the Rosh would have done that for every mitzvah. All of it would have been translated. And they would have known all the Torah. They may not know the Rashba and the Ritva, but they would have known the whole transmission that was given from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe to give to us. And now read the pasuk Rabbi Yochanan says, according to Tosas. God says, if I would have written down most of my Torah, which is the oral transmission, Jews would be strangers. Jews and the Torah wouldn't have a special relationship. Every guy on the street, not only would he have the 5 books of Moses, which they call the Old Testament, he would have a wonderful, nice, the 5 books of Moses would have in it everything that only we know right now, and they wouldn't know. Phylacteries, put the phylacteries on your head. And phylacteries is a box, and it's a black box. And it has a shin on 2 sides. One shin has 4 legs, one shin has 3 legs. And inside the box, there are 4 compartments. And this is what you put in the 4 compartments. And this is the brachim, v'chulu v'chulu. So that special relationship that only Jews have with Torah would have been destroyed because everybody would be able to read everything. So Rabbi Yochanan says most of the Torah was transmitted orally. Only a small portion of summary was written. And the Rosh did this so that when the Goyim translate that which is written, they won't have a clue of what's going on. and the relationship between the Torah and the Jewish people be an intimate, personal relationship, because we have that oral transmission to know what a phylacteries is, and to know how to make a mezuzah, and to know how to make matzah, etc., etc. And the rest of them can keep on reading whatever they want, and they don't have a clue what's going on. We know what's going on, and therefore we have a strong, intimate relationship with the Torah. So the Rosh Hashanah says, according to Vayeishev, Echtayv Lairube Tairasi, had I written down roast of the Torah, Jewish people are strangers to the Torah. It would be a special relationship. Therefore, the Rosh Hashanah wrote only a minimal amount in the written Torah. The rest of it he left for the oral transmission to Moshe, which we got with Davis. I'll just give you one example. These people don't know what's flying. Besides, I mean, you can see that they would know what's flying. They would be clueless. I've given this example several times. Just it's an example that sticks in my mind about Rabbi Yochanan. After Lairube Terasi, Kamoi Zor Nechshavu. When I was the Rav in Danville, Virginia, many years ago, wonderful, wonderful community. Much has been written about it. Danville is about a 20-minute drive to the border of North Carolina, so we're in the South. And we got a lot of evangelicals there. We're very interested in Judaism. And one of the things that occurred while I was the Rav in Danville was that I would get calls from different people and say they want to learn about Judaism because they want to convert. One of the calls I got was from a woman who told me that her niece would like to convert. I said, what's the story? What does she want to convert? She said that there's an Israeli young man who sells novelty items. He goes around America and he's like an importer. He brings stuff from China, Japan, whatever. And these novelty shop items, little games, little toys, goes around America and he's a salesman for this. And he stops off in our little town in North Carolina. My daughter got to know him. And they want to get married. And she starts telling me about how she accommodates. Apparently, the girl is growing up with this aunt. She's not growing up with her parents. I think the parents were out of the house because she was interested in Judaism. So the girl's living with her aunt. And she starts telling me how she accommodates this boy, this young man, when he comes from Israel through North Carolina for his sales. She tells me that he takes one of the 4 burners on the stove top and he turns on the fire for like a half an hour, and no one can use that burner while he's in the house. He doesn't eat with us. He brings his own food. And even in the morning, we see him every day putting on these black boxes on his hand and on his head. Okay, so I got a picture here already. We have whatever level, we have someone who is ashamed of Torah mitzvahs. He's putting on tefillin, he's makbid on kashrus. Said she wants to marry this boy. The boy said, I can't marry you, you're not Jewish. And the aunt tells me she's really been always interested in Judaism, but now she really wants to learn more about it and she wants to convert, which of course puts up the red signal in front of me, the whole shaila of, can you convert someone for the sake of marriage? Okay, but that red light goes off. I continue listening to the story, and she says, can we at least meet with you? I said, fine. We set up a time, a date. The aunt comes with the niece, and we're talking now about like 38 years ago. The world was very different 38 years ago. The world was very different a year ago, and 5 years ago. The world was very different 38 years ago. And the girl comes in with her aunt. And as my wife said, she saw the girl, she saw the aunt. She looked like the most sneer-sticker Beis Yaakov girl. And she had a very, very fine adin looking tzura, very fine looking face, very, very unusual. She had a mamish like a very fine-looking young woman. We start talking about the boy, why does she want to convert? We start talking about the Torah and what the Torah means to her. However, we got to the conversation, the aunt says to me, you know what? This whole idol worship thing, serving God, it's the opposite. Serving God really begins with Enoch. Use the word Enoch. Now, at that point in time, I'm about, I don't know, maybe 23, 24, when I became Rav in Danville. I had left yeshiva. I'm Danville, Virginia. Yeshiva boys don't know what Enoch is. Who is Enoch? I'm listening. And she says, Enoch begins the service of God. Now I'm really interested to know who this Enoch is, because who is this Enoch that started Avodas Hashem? So I start talking to her about this Enoch, and finally she says to me, she pulls out from her pocketbook, she has, of course, an evangelical, she has the Testament with her in her pocketbook. That's how these people walk around, or at least used to in the South. Remember the days in the motels, there was always a Gideon. This is how these people in the South walked around. So she pulls out from her pocketbook a testament. And she says it's in Genesis chapter 5, verse 26. I pull out my chumash off the shelf, and it says, Ulashem gamhu yulad ben, vayikra shmo Enosh. Ah, Enosh. They call him Enoch. We call him Enosh. Okay, now I know the pasuk. And I read the pasuk, and it says, Os huchal likro b'shem Hashem. Now the word huchal, they misinterpreted to the word huchal, which in some context can mean started. So the Goyim translated in their Old Testament, Shes had a son, and he was called Enosh, Enoch, as huchal likro b'shem Hashem. And at that time they started calling and praying to God. Enosh is the one who starts praying and serving God. But I had this memory that that's not what the pasuk means. So I go to my Rashi, and Rashi says, "Os huchal loshen chulin." Huchal here doesn't mean they started calling in the name of God. Huchal is from the word chulin, mundane, to desanctify. Rashi says, "Likroy eshmois ha'od v'eshmois ha'atzom v'eshmois ha'kadosh baruch hu la'asoisem avodah zarah." Os huchal likro b'shem Hashem means they took the name of God and disgraced it. They desanctified it. We have something called Kodesh, holy. We have something called Chulin, not holy. Os huchal likro b'shem Hashem, and then they took God's name and made it unholy. They started worshiping Avodah Zarah. So this woman's telling me, oh, Enoch, this Enoch, he started praying to God and he started the service of God. Okay, you don't have a clue. And you're going to go through the rest of your life not having a clue about what the Old Testament means, because you don't know what's going on here. You don't have a Kabbalah from Chazal that goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu about what the words mean. Enoch did not start the worship of God. Enoch started the door of Avodah Zarah. Okay. That's just, the examples are legion. They go on and on and on. They're clueless. They don't know what's going on here. So Rabbi Yochanan says, exclamation point. If I would have written down the whole Torah for the Jewish people, they would have taken the whole thing and translated into every language, and then the Jews would be foreigners to the Torah. They not spend no special relationship with the Torah and Jews. Everybody knows what the Torah means. So Rabbi Shalom Rabbi Yochanan says, wrote down a summary in writing, and the majority of the Torah was an oral transmission to Moshe, which has come down to us. Of course, there's the art scroll out there today. There are all kinds of sheets about that. I'm not going to get into the art scroll. It has a lot of haskamas, but the haskamas also right in there when you can use it, how you should use it, say that. But with the art scroll, You can go in there and the guy go in there and learn Ganshas. In fact, there's a funny story. I think it's funny, it could be sad. My shver, who was a Rav for many, many years in New York, he told me that he was once at a meeting of rabbis, and there was something going on. I forgot the name of the guy in New York. It's O'Connor, I don't remember what his name was. He was an archbishop, and there were constantly issues with him, going back many years, and rabbinic groups would meet with him to try to work things out. So this was a meeting with a rabbinic group. My shver was at the meeting, and someone's reporting back about this meeting with this archbishop, and they made a statement to the archbishop, whatever it was. I don't even remember now what it was. They said this and this and this and this and this. And the archbishop said to them, I don't believe that's the only way that Judaism interprets XYZ. I think there are other ways that Judaism interprets XYZ. So the rabbi looked at him and said, what exactly are you talking about? This is Judaism's interpretation of XYZ. He says, Rabbi, in my study, I have a whole set of art scroll, the 6 Sidorim of the Mishnah. And in the English commentary, specifically on this question, I recall that there are several different opinions as to what the interpretation of XYZ is. And the rabbi then reported this back to the whole meeting of the rabbis that this is what happened there. So this is an example. Exclamation point. God said to Moshe, I write the whole thing down. The Jews are not special anymore. Everybody's learning Torah. So Baruch Shalom only wrote down the minimal in Torah Shebeksav and left most of it for Torah Sheba Al Peh. Further down the Gemara, at the second arrow, the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan said, like Karas HaKadosh Baruch Hu bris im Yisrael el b'shvil dvorim Sheba Al Peh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's covenant with the Jewish people. What is the covenant based on? What did God give us and what did we take that made a permanent covenant between us? So Rabbi Yochanan says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's covenant with us is based only on Dvorim Sheba Al Peh, only on the oral transmission. Shenema, the Pasuk says that we quoted earlier, Ki al pi hadvorim ha'ela karati itcha b'sras Yisrael. God said to Moshe, it is on these words that I make the covenant with you. Pi, peh, it's not the written, it is through the oral law that I'm going to teach you, that you will transmit from generation to generation, which will leave the goyim clueless as to what my godly intention is and how to perform Torah mitzvahs, and therefore Torah mitzvah will be a personal, special thing only for the Jewish people. This is where the covenant is. What does the word covenant mean? A bris? Rav Hutner explains, a bris means between me and you, or between the three of us. The idea of a bris always includes and always excludes. A bris includes certain people and excludes other people. That's what a bris is about. A treaty is between certain people and it excludes others. So Rabbi Yochanan is telling us that the bris, the covenant that God made with us, which means with us to the exclusion of the rest of the world, is based on Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's based on the oral transmission. The first page of the handout, because of time, I'm going to say most of it Ba'al Peh, right? Oral transmission. It's written down in Bachad Yitzchak Ma'aralef on Chanukah. This is what Rav Hutner explained. There's a Gemara in Yuma. The Gemara in Yuma Daf Chof Tes says, Lamatzeach al Ayeles Hashacha Mizmor LeDavid. It's a pasuk. It's a famous kapitel Tehillim. I believe it's chapter 22 in Tehillim. The kapitel says, Keli, Keli, lama zaftani, God, God, why have you forsaken me? The Gemara there in Yuma Chavtes talks about that this kapitel Tehillim was written by David HaMelech prophetically about Esther, when Esther would go in. Of course, Esther is David HaMelech is before the Beis HaMikdash is even built. Esther is at the end of the Golus Bavel. So we're talking about hundreds of years. David HaMelech is writing this prophetically about when Esther goes into Achashverosh without having been called and puts her life on the line for Klal Yisrael. So David HaMelech saw this Baruch HaKodesh, and he wrote this Kapitel Chaf Beis. So the Kapitel Chaf Beis is talking about Esther and the miracle of Purim. So the Gemara there says, Lamatzech al Ayeles HaShachar. Ayeles HaShachar means dawn, sort of the end of the night. Tzech al Ayeles HaShachar means another dawn. So the Gemara asks, Lama nimshla Esther la'Ayeles l'Shachar. Why is Esther like that dense, dark morning right before dawn? It's very dark. Why is Esther compared to dark, to this end, this dark period? The Gemara says, Ma shacha kol seif kol halayla, af Esther seif kol hanisim. The same way that the end of night, the dawn says, this is the end, we're closing off the night, and the day is soon coming. It's a closure. So too, Esther is a closure. With Esther ended all miracles. Mashacha kol seif halayla, af Esther seif hanisim. Esther is the end of all miracles. So Gemara asks for Ikka Chanukah. What are you talking about? Esther is the last miracle. Chanukah happened. Esther is before the second Beis HaMikdash. Chanukah is 200 years or so in the second Beis HaMikdash. So what do you mean Esther is the last miracle? We know Chanukah. Chanukah should be the last miracle. So the Gemara says, Nitna lihi kosef amina. I'm only discussing miracles that were written down. Esther was written down in one of the books of Ksuvim, our Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. The last book that ever got incorporated into our Tanakh was Megillas Esther. Right? We have no Megillas Hanukkah. There are books, the Maccabean books, this book, that book, whatever they may be, who wrote them, were they reliable? We don't read Megillas Hanukkah. There's no Megillas Hanukkah. Our Megillas Hanukkah is lighting Hanukkah candles. We don't have Megillas Hanukkah, as we explained in the last couple of weeks. There's no Nevi'im. The last Navi Malachi died about 40 years into the second Beis HaMikdash. So Hanukkah occurs about 160 years after the last Navi died. There are no Nevi'im to write any books. So we have no books. We have an oral transmission of Hanukkah. How do we know about Hanukkah? It's an oral transmission. The Gemara says, why do you call Esther the last miracle, but there's Hanukkah? So the Gemara says, because Esther is nitnli kaseh. Esther is the last miracle written down. Chanukah never got written down. And when David HaMelech said, Esther is like the dawn, the same way the dawn is the end of night, closure, so too Esther is closure. No more miracles. No more written miracles. That's what we mean. But there's unwritten miracles. Chanukah is an unwritten miracle. So Afutna explains in the first Maimon on Chanukah that defines the miracle of Chanukah. The miracle of Chanukah is unwritten. The last written miracle is Megillas Esther, and that closed the books of Tanakh. And now we have miracles like Chanukah that are unwritten. So you say to me, yeah, but I learned about it in Gemara Shabbos. Yeah, but Gemara Shabbos wasn't always written down. Gemara Shabbos eventually got written down because people were forgetting Gemara. Eis Lasos Lashem. Torah, what do we call Mishnah and Gemara? Torah Shabal Peh. It's the oral transmission. This wasn't written down. This is Moshe Rabbeinu got the oral transmission. The Rebbeinu Shalom said, Moshe, this is how you do tefillin. So we have a whole set of Gemaras and Menachos about how to put a tefillin. Moshe, this is how you eat matzah and you keep Pesach, and this is how you search for chametz, and this is how you do the mitzvahs of the Leil HaSeder, the Morah, Korban Pesach. This is how you do it. It wasn't written down. It's an oral transmission. Today we have it in Masechta Pesachim. All of this was oral transmission until the time came in the days of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi where people could no longer remember all these things, and he decided, because of the Tzorech Hashah, to write it down. But before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote it down, how did you know what Hanukkah is? only by word of mouth. Let's go back to before the times of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Let's go to the days of Hillel Hanassi. Hillel Hanassi, our great Hillel. Hillel lived, according to the Gemara in Shabbos, 100 years before the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. The Rambam, when you do the history, the second Beis Hamikdash stood for 420 years. The miracle of Chanukah occurs about 200 years into the second Beis Hamikdash. So we know, and the Rambam says this at the beginning of Hilchos Chanukah, after the miracle of Chanukah, the second Beis Hamikdash stood for approximately 200 plus years. You have the first 200 years of the second Beis Hamikdash. The Persians dominated it, then the Greek Syrians dominated it, and then there was the revolution by the Hashmonaim, and then they take back the Beis Hamikdash, and the Beis Hamikdash stands for 200 plus years. Let's assume 220 years. So between the miracle of Hanukkah and the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash by the Romans, there's 220 years. Hillel, let's take him as an example. Hillel lived 100 years before the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, which means Hillel lived at least 100 years after the Hanukkah miracle. There's no Megillas Chanukah. And there's no Gemara written down. It's Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Gemara is going to be written down, the Mishnah is going to be written down centuries later when Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi arrives on the scene. When Hillel is living, he's the Nasi of the Jewish people. It's 100 years after the Hanukkah people. People are observing Hanukkah every year. And how are they observing Hanukkah? Hillel's walking. So let's make up a story here. Hillel is walking with his kindlech, children, grandchildren of Shimon, Gamliel. He's walking with his kindlech, his grandchildren, and he says to them, tonight is the 25th night of Kislev. And we're going to light Hanukkah candles. And this is how we light it. And this is the brachas we're going to make. So the kindlech and the einiklech say Zaidi. Where does it say this? Does it say it in Bereshis, Shmois, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim? Is it in Yoshua, Shoftim? Is it in Yirmiyah, Yecheskel, Yeshaya? Is it in Koheles? Is it in Mishlei? Is it in Tehillim? Is it in Eicha? Is it in Megillas Esther? Is it in Koheles? Is it in Shir Hashirim? Where is this mitzvah, Zaidi? And Hillel said to them, it's not written anywhere. Not in the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, not in Nevi'im, not in Ksuvim. He says, Zaidi, if it's not written anywhere, how do you know that there's such a yontif? That you have to do a mitzvah of Hanukkah candles? And how do you know all the rules of how to light Hanukkah candles? How do you know what brachas to make? How do you know where to light it? So Hillel introduces his children and grandchildren to a new idea. Tatala. There's something called Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah. And there's something called Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. And the oral Torah is the Torah that I'm teaching you right now. It's not written down, it's a transmission. 100 years ago, there was this and this miracle, and this is this, what the Chachamim said 100 years ago, how to do this mitzvah. And that generation passed it down to that next generation, next generation, next generation. And my father told me that this is what we do on Chaf Hei Kislev for 8 days. And now I'm orally transmitting it to you, kindlech, so that you can transmit it to the next generation. And that's how Hanukkah was observed until Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi came and it got written down. Well, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi also didn't really write it down. It appears in the Gemara. Hanukkah appears basically one, perhaps two places in Mishnayos. But it was Torah Sheba'al Peh. So now let's put the one and one together. We learned the Gemara in Gittin that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's covenant with the Jewish people is not based on the written law, because everybody translated the written law. This one's got Phylacteries and this one's got Enoch. Everybody's translated the written Torah to mean whatever they want it to mean, but they're clueless, but they translate it any which way they mean, but they don't know what they're talking about. But the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which was a transmission, oral transmission from Moshe down to Yoshua, down to all the way the Dairis, until they had to write it down because they had no choice. Remained Jewish property. And the Gemara we just read said that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's covenant with the Jewish people is based upon this part of the Torah, the oral Torah. No one can write that down because they don't have it. And this is our personal relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the Torah Sheba Al Peh. Given that, if that's the personal relationship that we develop with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is only through the Torah Sheba Al Peh, not through the written Torah, and Hanukkah is a miracle that's a Torah Sheba'al Peh miracle. It's unwritten. Esther is the last written miracle. Hanukkah remained unwritten. And the only way to transmit it from generation to generation was by going like Hillel did. I want to tell you word of mouth, and you pass it down word of mouth. It's Torah Sheba'al Peh. Chanukah becomes the first miracle of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and Torah Sheba'al Peh is the covenant of the Jewish people with God, which means that Chanukah is an unbelievable mitzvah, an unbelievable time. When we light the Chanukah candles, we're celebrating the fact that we have Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that Torah Sheba'al Peh is our covenant with Rabbeinu Shalom and nothing else. And now Chanukah represents the private, personal Jewish relationship with the Rabbeinu Shalom. Imagine, today we have Gemaras written down, we have Masifta, we have Atzkol. Imagine going back to Hillel. Hillel took his children, his grandchildren, and they're standing by the menorah the first night Hanukkah, and he's making brachas. He says, see, Kindler, this is the mitzvah. I know it's not written anywhere, but I want to teach it to you word of mouth, and you teach it to your children word of mouth, because this is the Torah that God gave the Jewish people based upon the oral transmission of Torah. And had he given all of it written, we all would have been strangers. A whole world would have had it. But we have Torah Sheba'al Peh. And this miracle of Hanukkah is a Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's not written anywhere. And this is the Torah for which HaKadosh Baruch Hu made this covenant with us. So Kindle, when I light this Hanukkah candle, this is the covenant with the Rabbeinu Shalom. This light that comes from the Hanukkah candle is what we transmit from generation to generation. And that remains Jewish property. And that remains Am Segula. Hanukkah candles, when we light the Hanukkah candles, is the Am Segula. This is the Torah Sheba'al Peh miracle. All the written miracles end with Esther. Unwritten miracles begin with Hanukkah, and these unwritten miracles are special because they are unwritten, and therefore they're given over generation to generation by word of mouth, the Messiah of Torah. That's where our footnote explains at the top of the second page of the Pachad Yitzchak. We go back to the Rambam that we mentioned earlier. The Rambam ends Hilchos Chanukah Perek Daled Halacha Yud Beis Mitzvahs Ner Chanukah Mitzvah Chaviva Hi Ad Ma'od. Where did the Rambam get this from? Maggid Mishnah has a shita. Where do you get this from? The Gemara doesn't say that the mitzvah of lighting Ner Chanukah is very beloved. It's very loved mitzvah. Mitzvahs Ner Chanukah, mitzvah chaviva hi ad ma'od. V'tzarach adam lizar, we have to be very careful with the Chanukah candles. L'idea hanes, you have to tell everybody about the miracle. What's the miracle? The miracle is the Chanukah candles. And one flask turned into enough for 8 nights. But what is at the center of this miracle? The center of this miracle is that this miracle got transmitted generation after generation through a Torah Sheba'al Peh, which keeps it personal Jewish property. The Torah is our Torah. They can have their Enochs, they can have their Phylacteries. They don't know what's going on until only us have this Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is the bris. This is the covenant between us and the Rabbeinu Shalom. This is the treaty. This is what makes us the Am Segula. This is what makes us special to the Rabbeinu Shalom. This is what happens when we light Ner Hanukkah, and when we establish this relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the Neres Hanukkah, the Rambam says, Mitzvahs Ner Hanukkah, Mitzvah Chavivi Ad Ma'oid. This is a very loved mitzvah. What is a treaty? What is a covenant between two people? The inclusion of a group to the exclusion of others, a new special relationship between the two people, a special relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom every time you light the Hanukkah candles. So mitzvah, Hanukkah mitzvah, Chavivi Ad Ma'oid, is a very beloved mitzvah. A person has to be very careful with it to publicize the miracle. We'll take another few minutes. The last page of the handout is from Rav Kook's Oris HaTorah, with the Pirish of Rav Drori Shli, he should be well. And in this, on the right hand of the page, there's bold letters. And that's Rav Kook. The left hand of the page, what's not bold, is Rav Drori Shli explaining Rav Kook. Just want to read Rav Kook's word here about Torah Shebal Peh. But Torah Shebal Peh, Yord, Anu Yordim Kvalachai. Torah Shebeksav, the Rebbeinu Shalom gave us in writing. It's the Rebbeinu Shalom's exact words. A Sefer Torah missing a letter, an extra letter, puzzle. This is the Rebbeinu Shalom's exact letters and exact words. They're exact and precise. That's Torah Shebeksav. It comes from the Holy One. Torah Shebal Peh is a Messiah that Moshe got orally from the Rebbeinu Shalom and transmitted generation to generation. Now, every generation, new questions come up. Can I use a potato peeler on Shabbos? Can I use a microwave for melechiks and fleishiks? All these questions that come up because time moves on and things are happening in the world, technology, etc. Can I use these things? When can I use these things? How can I use these things? Does halacha let me use these things? I have a timer on my air conditioner. Can I change the prongs while it's on, while it's off? Can I lengthen the time, shorten the time? Who's going to answer these questions? Where are you going to find the answer? You're not going to find it in the written Torah. You're not going to find it in the Gemara. Where are you going to find it? You're going to find it in Torah Shebal Peh, where our Chachmei Hadoros look at the principles that were given to Moshe and brought into the Mishnah and brought into the Gemara. These are principles, and they apply those God-given principles to the prongs in a timer of an air conditioner. And they apply those principles to a microwave, melechiks, and fleishiks. And they apply those principles to a dishwasher, melechiks or fleishiks. And they apply those halachas to, can you light a menorah with electric bulbs? Who is doing this? The Chachmei Hadoros doing it through Torah Shebal Peh. They're making our lives adaptable to changes that are occurring. We don't adapt our life. We don't adapt the halacha to the changes. The halacha remains the halacha, and the principles there are immutable. But we need to know how to adjust our lives based upon those immutable principles. What are you going to tell me? You tell me you're not allowed to buy a microwave. Or you're not allowed to use a potato. Don't even buy it. You can't use a potato. Someone has to develop the initial principles that are godly given to Moshe and apply them in today's situation. So Torah Shebal Peh is the ability of the Chachamim of every door to take those principles and apply it to life situations every generation as situations change, science changes, technology changes. Answers need to be given. Where are you going to draw these answers from? From the Mishnah, from the Torah, the Mishnah Gemara, and you're going to have to derive it from these godly principles. So Rav Kook wrote, "But Torah Shebal Peh Anu Yordim Kvalachayim." Torah Shebal Peh is the Chachmei Hadoros ability to apply God-given principles into daily life. So Rav Drori explains, "But Torah Shebal Peh Anu Yordim Ha'goy V'Shel Torah Shebeksav." There's a change. Torah Shebeksav is studying God's exact, precise words. And they are those words. And we have all kinds of lessons to learn from those words. When we get into Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral transmission, that's the interpretation of the laws that God gave us. And as time goes on, different situations come up where that law needs to be applied in a daily life basis. Is machine matzah okay? Can you use a machine to make matzah? Who's going to answer that question? Where are you going to find the answer in the Gemara? Does there have to be hand matzah? Hand shmura? Can it be 18-minute machine? What kind of machine is it? We have to look at the machine. Is the machine making chametz? Is she making matzah? Is machlokes? A big machlokes haposkim when the machines came out. Who's going to answer these questions? These are questions of technology moving forward. These are questions of how do I live my life now in a new kind of world that has new kind of inventions, where new things are happening, new situations occur. Who's going to answer these questions? Chachmei Hador are going to answer it by applying principles of Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Kach Rav Drowi writes, HaTorah Sheba'al Peh machdira et hachachma elyon lo mazeh. Torah Sheba'al Peh are Chachmei Hadoros who give us the halachas, who give us the hashkafas to live by in every generation. Our generation, modern times, quote unquote, is the application, the deep application of God's written, precise Torah and applying it into this world. And it sets our lives on the foundation of Torah. Shabbos clocks. Today everybody assumes, yeah, of course, you can put a Shabbos clock in and the lights go on and off on Shabbos. Of course you can, not a problem, because everybody's been doing it for so long. But there's a tshuva negus Moshe, when the Shabbos, when these clocks, these time clocks first came out. So you're talking about maybe, could be a 50-year-old tshuva, maybe more than that. And Moshe was asked, can you use the Shabbos clock on Shabbos? Why? It's Marasayan. Very few people knew what a Shabbos clock was. And the windows open, and they see their next door neighbor who goes to shul on Shabbos, his lights are going on and off on Shabbos. They say, I never, Reuben became a Chal Shabbos. It's a Shiloh Marasayim. Rav Moshe had a paskin whether you can use a Shabbos clock under those circumstances. Parva milk. Today, of course, we go to a chasana at the end of this fleishik meal where the waiter asks us, would you like coffee or tea? We say coffee. And he pours a white thing into the coffee. It looks exactly like milk. Are you allowed to use parva milk? The Shiloh is also raised. It's Shiloh of Marasayan. It's a Shiloh in Shulchan Aruch about milk that's made from almonds. Can you put almond milk on a fleishik table? People look at it and don't know, and they think that you're oichel basa b'chalav. And that's why originally the minhag was that when you had the parva milk, you would put the container of parva milk on the table so that people can see it's parva milk. You didn't take the parva milk and put it into a nice pitcher. You kept it in the box that said parva on it. Who's going to answer these shilas as parva milk gets developed and as Shabbos clocks get developed? Who's going to answer? Who's going to make it up? Who's going to tell us whether in today's modern Jewish life these things can be used? Based upon the principles given orally from Moshe, from the Rosh Hashanah to Moshe, passed down through the generations. So Chanukah is the yontif Afutna explains of Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's the first miracle that remained unwritten. Esther is closure on the written miracles. And the same way that Megillas Esther is written down in the books of Tanakh, the Goyim have the book of Esther. The Goyim don't have a book of Hanukkah. They can't. It's not never written down. When they translated the Torah into foreign languages, there was no Hanukkah to write down. They didn't have a Hanukkah. So Hanukkah remains private Jewish property. They couldn't write it down. And that Torah Sheba'al Peh is the yesod of Hanukkah. And that Torah Sheba'al Peh is the source of the covenant between the Jewish people and the Rebbeinu Shalom. And when we light our Hanukkah candles, we're celebrating this mitzvah chaviva, this beloved mitzvah, that we have a special relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom. Only we have this Torah Sheba'al Peh. And because that Torah Sheba'al Peh, we can live generation after generation, and through Chachmei Hadoros, we understand how to apply the original principles to the most modern day situations. And that is Hanukkah. It's a Jewish property. It's a special relationship between us and the Parshas, and that's what we're doing when we light Hanukkah candles. In fact, the Gemara in Shabbos, in the Hanukkah Sugya, which we learned during the Hanukkah Shiurim, the Gemara says when you light Hanukkah candles, you make 3 brachas. And the first one is Asher Kiddushanu Mitzvaysa V'tzivanu Lahadlik Ner Shel Hanukkah. You commanded me to light the Hanukkah candles. That's the bracha we're going to start saying tonight, Amir Tzashem. So the Gemara asks on Shabbos Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph, V'heichen Tzivanu. Where did God command me? Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. Blessed are you, God, King of the world. Asher Kiddushanu Mitzvaysa. You sanctified me with your mitzvahs. V'tzivanu, and you commanded me. Remember the kasha that the Kinderlach and the Einiklach of Hillel asked Zaidi? Where did this mitzvah come from? It's not written. It's not in the Torah. It's not in the Nevi'im. It's not in the Ksuvim. Then how can you say Tzivanu? Moshe didn't tell us to do it. None of the Shoftim told us to do it. We don't have a Novi that told us to do it. How do you say V'tzivanu? Who's V'tzivanu? Who commanded us to do Hanukkah? The Gemara, one of the 2 Gemara's answers are Rav Nechemia Omar Sh'al Avicha V'yageitcha Zekeinecha V'yomulach. It comes from the pasuk in Hazinu. You want to know why you can say V'tzivanu tonight and the next 8 nights for Hanukkah? Asher Kiddushanu Mitzvaysa V'tzivanu. How do you say V'tzivanu? Who commanded you? Nehemiah says a pasuk in the Torah. It says Sha'al Avicha V'yageitcha Zekeinecha V'yomulach. Ask your father, he will tell you. Go to your elders, and they will instruct you. You're right. The Gemara says, where were we commanded? When the Gemara asks, Heichen Tzivanu, we're expecting a pasuk. There's no pasuk. Where did God command us? Because God wrote in the Torah, you ask your father, you ask previous generations, you ask the elders, and that's where the truth lies. And that's the mitzvah of Hanukkah. We light Hanukkah candles, we say V'tzivanu, and the V'tzivanu doesn't point to a single pasuk. It's pure Torah Shebal Peh. It's word of mouth from our parents, word of mouth from our elders. Hanukkah, I'll end with this. When I was Rav in Danville, as I mentioned earlier, just came out of yeshiva, and the yeshiva bracha. As I told the story, won't go into today. For about 10 months, I took a course. Was the first year the course was offered in Brooklyn. Took a course with I think about 10 or 11 other young men who were in Kailul to teach us how to be rabbanim or principals in day schools. And the goal was to take these 12 and send them out of New York to different communities and make them rabbanim and make them principals in day schools. And that's how I ended up at the Rav of Danville, Virginia. But I'm a yeshiva bacha. I don't know from rabbinic groups. I don't know from, that's all I know is the Torah that I learned in yeshiva. That's it. I come to Danville, Virginia. Danville, Virginia had what you would call an active Reform temple. I grew up in Brooklyn in a frum home. I don't know from Reform. I just heard about Reform, the Apikursim, they drive on Shabbos, they eat Nevelas Utrefas. I heard, okay, they have a temple. I don't know from him, I don't know from them. I think I once discussed a story about there's a kaplan that came to be the clergyman of this Reform temple. And I'm talking about a little Reform now because this has become a very big issue now here in Eretz Yisrael. There's a whole Maisa with Rav Malamed, and the whole Maisa now that's going on literally in the Supreme Court about recognizing, the last couple of days, recognizing conversion by Reform and conservative Jews, chas v'sholem, oyim v'noiva, such a gzeira. They're mamish not geirim, they're mamish goyim, and they're fighting in the Supreme Court, and they already really won in the Supreme Court, that a Reform or conservative convert should be able to get stamped Yehudi in Eretz Yisrael. Chas v'sholem is mamish a gzeira noiva oyim. So that's what I know about Reform. And it's a couple of days before Hanukkah, and every day I get delivered to my door the local newspaper that I believe was called the Danville Register. every day I open up, I read the news, I read the editorial page. Editorial page has a story about Hanukkah. And it's written by this guy Kaplan, a clergyman of the Reformed Temple. And he's explaining what Hanukkah is to, as I said before, Southern evangelicals. The Southern evangelicals are opening the paper in Danville, Virginia, wherever else was distributed. They're reading what the meaning of Hanukkah is. And they're reading it written, they're reading it from Mamish. One of the things that this Kaplan introduced in Danville, Virginia, is he would officiate. I think they do it today, not a big deal. He officiates, one of the first in America to officiate interreligious, interfaith marriages. Okay. Goy, Yid, will be Masada Kiddush. So he wrote an article, and it talks about Hanukkah, what Hanukkah is. And he's comparing Hanukkah to Christmas. It comes about the same time of year, and the idea of gifts, and why it's important to have the Christmas, Lahavdil, and the Hanukkah at the time of the solstice, and what it means. Divrei Kfira, Mamish destroyed the whole concept of Hanukkah. I don't know from any Chachmas. I'm a yeshiva bacher. Okay. So what do? I take the old-time typewriters, right, that still had the correction ribbon on it. I'm not a fast typist. I start working on a letter to the editor. I finish the letter to the editor, and I get into my car, and I go to the Danville Register, and I introduce myself. I'm the rabbi of the Orthodox Synagogue. Here's a letter to the editor commenting on Hanukkah. The next day, the letter's printed in the Danville Register. I start getting calls from the people in the shul. People in the shul, the Orthodox shul, never had children who became reforms. They're davening in the quote unquote. They're members of the Reform Temple. So now this has caused an interfamily kind of strife. The kids from the temple are calling their parents in the Orthodox shul. What kind of crazy young guy did you hire here? He attacked our Kaplan, and he says that Kaplan doesn't know what he's talking about, and Kaplan is a faithless person, and he's a denier of God, and what kind of person did you hire? And I start getting calls from the people in the Orthodox shul. So we had a little meeting in the shul. I explained to them that, listen, this is a Chil Hashem. I'm in the center, I'm 20 minutes from North Carolina. I'm the center of Southern evangelicals. When you come to Hanukkah, you're dealing with explaining to the world how Jews are the chosen people. That's why we light the Hanukkah candles, because of the Torah Shabbal Peh. Now, Torah Shabbal Peh is our covenant with the Rebbe Shalom. And in 15 minutes, I explained to them what we've been talking about at length today. I said, for a person who calls himself a rabbi to write, if he wants to talk from the pulpit in his temple, he can do whatever he wants. He eats chazer, he drives to shul on Shabbos, he can lecture whatever he wants from the pulpit. But if he wants to write in a publicly disseminated newspaper that this is what Chanukah means, and the way he interprets Chanukah is, Kulanu Achim, we're all brothers, you got Kratzmach, I got Chanukah, it all means the same thing. The whole point of Hanukkah is that they're not the same thing. You're not me, I'm not you. I have a private personal property called Torah Shabbal Peh. This is the holiday of Am Segula, and he's telling the world we're not Am Segula. I'm sorry. I have to protest this in the very publication which you wrote. Okay. So he wrote back a letter to the editor, Kaplan, and tried to explain himself. Now, of course, once you're living in a pit, what you do when you try to get out of the pit many times, instead of climbing out of the pit, you dig the pit deeper. So he even made things worse, to which I replied again in a letter to the editor, and that's where it ended. Why am I telling you this story? Hanukkah has become a very sensitive mitzvah to me, both for the reasons we discussed today, the halacha, and because of that event where I see that there's a world of Jews, quote unquote, out there who want to bedafka take Hanukkah because it comes out about the same time as Kratzmach. And they say they got a tree in the window, we got a menorah in the window, they got socks full of gifts, we give out money. And we're really doing the same thing, except we call it different things. And the whole mitzvah of Ner Hanukkah is Pasum Nissa, to publicize the miracle, the Jewish people, with Am Segula. What in the world are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing to Hanukkah? You just debased and destroyed Hanukkah. This has always been a personal issue to me. And it's out there. It's out there in Jewish circles. It's out there in Goyish circles. It's Hanukkah. It's Christmas. Then the interfaith couples, we have a tree and a menorah. The whole point of Hanukkah is, I don't have a tree and you don't have a menorah. Almost on a daily basis, I read something called the National Review. I don't read the whole National Review. It's online. It's a very interesting magazine. It's one of the few magazines that deals with current events, one of the few magazines left in the world where there are liberal writers, there are conservative writers, where you can actually get two sides of a picture. You get two opinions on something. You have today the radicalization. The left doesn't want to hear the right doesn't want to hear the left. Everybody's radicalized and polarized. This is one of the last places where actually educated human beings from both sides write their opinion. So I don't read every article every day. I read some articles. Yesterday, there was an article in the Daily Record, in the National Review, and this is what it looked like. The true meaning of Hanukkah. This is in a National Review. It's circulated all over the world through the internet. It's called The True Meaning of Hanukkah. Even has a nice picture. Who wrote this article? A person by the name of David Harsanyi. David Harsanyi, if you ever read anything about him, David Harsanyi is a Jewish man. He was born in Hungary, and he's an avowed atheist. Many times he writes articles. In the article, talk as an atheist. So this atheist, writes an article that's called The True Meaning of Hanukkah. Of course, it's one of these, it's mamish, it's disgusting. And I'm not going to just give you an example, one quote. He quotes some magazine called Parents Magazine. I don't know what that is, but there's a story in this Parents Magazine that's headlined, How to Explain the Hanukkah Story to Kids. And it has he quotes from it about teach your family about the holiday. It celebrates the power of miracles. Okay, I don't know. I haven't read the parents article, but it talks about miracles. Now, you know that one of the animamins, or anilomamins, one of the anilomamins of an atheist is anilomamin benisa. I do not believe there's such a thing as miracles. I'm an atheist. There's no God. There's nobody doing miracles. So one of their anilomamins is anilomamin ben miracles. So he's very upset that the Parents Magazine, How to Explain the Hanukkah Story to Kids, talks about the fact that you can teach your kids about miracles. So he writes the following. He's quoting the parents, and he writes the following. This kind of insufferably vacuous, anesthetized, consumerist celebration that American Jews have concocted to compete with Christmas is stripped of any genuine theological or cultural meaning. It's disgusting. This is our private property, Yontif. You're mechutziv. You're an atheist. You don't believe in miracles. Then why are you writing about miracles if you don't believe in the opinion? I'm all for two sides of an opinion. I'm all for two sides of a question. That's why I read National Review. Maybe he's right, maybe he's right. I'm willing to listen. But when someone says, I don't believe there's such a thing as a miracle, now let me tell you, now that I don't believe in miracles, let me tell you what the true meaning of Hanukkah is. Something's missing here. So I don't know if they'll publish it or not. This got me very aggravated yesterday. So I wrote a letter to the editors of the National Review. And I pointed out to them the different places, different articles where he's written, I'm an atheist. And I basically left them with a question. Is it appropriate for a magazine that always is talking about providing two opinions, knowledgeable opinions that are based upon facts and correct analysis, is it appropriate for a person who you know is an atheist to write an article about the true meaning of Hanukkah, not the meaning of Hanukkah? So I said, please republish the article, and instead of titling the article The True Meaning of Hanukkah, the name of the article should be The True Meaning of Hanukkah According to an Atheist. Okay, the true meaning of Hanukkah according to an atheist, but it's not the true meaning of Hanukkah. The true meaning of Hanukkah according to an atheist. Nirama Yeh. Soif Dava, Hanukkah is ours. It's private Jewish property. It represents the private Jewish property of the Jewish people. It represents the Am Segula. The Rambam says it's a mitzvah chaviva. That's why it's so beloved a mitzvah. And this is why when you see these kind of things written or said about Hanukkah, don't let it pass you by. It's as if someone said to you, I know the Jewish people. In the Old Testament, it says you're a chosen people, but you're not a chosen people. You're like everyone else. You don't let that fly by you. That's a personal insult. The Rabbanu Shalom said we are a chosen people. It's insulting to God. It's insulting to us. Hanukkah, the lighting those candles, the Hanukkah time is the time of Torah Shebaal Peh, the covenant with God, our Torah, our personal relationship with God. And no Harsanis and no Kaplans are going to tell us what the meaning of Hanukkah is. Let's go back to the last question. We said that Torah Shebaal Peh, Rav Drori, explaining Rav Kook, said that the purpose of Torah Shebaal Peh, the Rebbeinu Shalom gave it to us, oral transmission, and what we do with Torah Shebaal Peh is the Chacham of every door explain to us what to do under new situations, under new sets of circumstances. Those new circumstances, how do we take old principles that were given to Moshe at Har Sinai, and what do we do with a Shabbos clock? What do we do with parva milk? What do we do with esrogim that don't have a pitim, that grow that way, etc.? The Torah Shebaal Peh, the Chachmei Adoros teaches this. Let's go back to that first medrash. The Rebbeinu Shalom created the light of Mashiach in this week's Parsha, and it was at that time when Yehuda left the mourners behind and went to go get a wife. The Rebbeinu Shalom said, he is the progenitor of Peretz, he's the progenitor of David HaMelech, he's the progenitor of David, of Mashiach ben David, because as Yirmiyah said, Anochi Yadat Tzemach, only I know what man is thinking. Yehuda wasn't thinking about himself. Yehuda was thinking about the Jewish people. Yehuda had a new situation in front of him, and God wasn't talking to him. God wasn't telling Yehuda what to do now. He could either sit down with the rest of his family and mourn and sit in mourning, or he can get up and say, I made a mistake. We sold Yosef. We still have a job to do here. We are the grandchildren of Avram and Sarah. Avram Avinu, Sarah Imenu. We are the grandchildren of Yitzchak Avinu and Rivka Imenu. I am a son of Yaakov Avinu and Leah Imenu, and we have a God-given job to build a nation that will bring the light of God to this world. We can all sit here and mourn at our mistake, or we can think about what do we do under this new circumstances where unfortunately we made a mistake. Yosef is gone, but we need to move forward and figure out what do we do now with this new situation. This is Torah Shebaal Peh. This is Yehuda's Torah Shebaal Peh. There's a new circumstance here, but how do we continue to build Judaism on the principles of Judaism? And Yehuda says, you know what? I have to go get a wife. I have to go and get married and create new generations of Jewish people so there'll be a Jewish people. We can't sit around and mourn forever. That's the God-given job to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, build the Jewish people. I'm getting up and getting a wife, and I'm proceeding with God's plan to build the Jewish people. The Baruch Shalom says at that second, this is what Yehuda's thinking, and no one else knows what he's thinking. Everybody thinks he's a selfish kid. He's going to get a wife while everybody's mourning. Baruch Shalom says, I know what's going through his mind. It's a king-type machshava. Kings make mistakes. Leaders make mistakes. And they say and admit they mistake. And then they say, yes, it's a mistake, but now we're proceeding further and we're building. That's a king. That's a leader. The Rebbeinu Shalom says, you know what? If you can figure out what to do under the most extreme circumstances, how do you proceed? What do I do under this new extreme circumstance? You're a leader. This is Torah Shabbat Peh. The ability to take God-given principles and to understand through them what to do in new circumstances and new situations that approach us on a daily basis. And Yehuda did this. This is in this week's Parsha. Mashiach is created through Yehuda's ability to adapt to this new situation and to adapt to it through the Torah perspective. This is Torah Shabbat Peh. This is Hanukkah. This is our special relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom. And this is the Hanukkah candles, a chaviva. It's so beloved by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We should light the candles with the chavivas. Light the candles, and remember when we say V'tzivonu, the V'tzivonu comes from Sha'al Avich V'Geitra. There's no book that talks about this. This is something that was transmitted from generation to generation. Our previous generations held the truth. They've passed down the truth to us. We are the bearers of the truth. We're not cancel culture people. We live in our Messiah. We're willing to die for the Messiah as the Chashmonaim were willing to do. And this is the holiness, and this is the love, the mitzvah of Hanukkah. All you need Yeshua Shav Yeshua, all you need Refuah Shav Refuah, all you need Lacham Shav Lacham, all you need Bracha Shav Brachas, all the Brachas, the Ashbaz, Taivas that the Rebbeinu Shalom should send them. Refuah Shalema to Yitzchak ben Rivka, Moshe Zelig ben Rezel, Yosef Chaim ben Shoshana Menucha, Shlomo ben Simcha, all the Cholei HaKorona, all the other people who need refuahs, B'Serach Shach, Early Yisrael, Force Nevishal, Force Zil, Pashtabak, Allah is my crib, Neymar, Amen. Everybody, take care of yourselves. Keep yourself healthy. You do what you need to do when you need to do it. You use your seichel. You Torah Sheba al Peh. You use your human understanding based upon the Torah principle of keep yourself healthy. We talked about this. It's a mitzvah, the last Ber Hagolin, Choshen Mishpat. It's the Ratzon and it's Avodas Hashem. It's Avodas Hashem. Tzitzis Avodas Hashem. Tefillin Avodas Hashem. Shabbos Avodas Hashem. Keep yourself healthy is Avodas Hashem. So this is the Torah Shabbat Peh that we use. What do I think the Seichel Yosher is for me to do under my given circumstances? What should I do? What should I not do? When should I go out? When should I go out? This is Torah Shabbat Peh. It's a mitzvah to think about and to do it right so we can remain healthy, well, happy to greet Mashiach Tzidkenu, whose light came into the world. In this week's Parsha, at the words Vayehi Ba'es Hahi at Revi in Parshas Vayeishev, when you hear that this week from the Balkari, Vayehi Ba'es Hahi, that's the moment in time that God created the Or Mashiach. We should be zeicha to see that light. Mamish today, B'Ratzon Hashem, B'Mher B'Yamein Amen. Everybody have a wonderful Shabbos, a freilichen Chanukah, a gesunden Chanukah. Everybody sei gesund. Kol tov.